Before the flags, before the wars, before the cities and the highways and the skyscrapers that touch the clouds, there was just land, vast, untouched, wild. And on that land, for thousands of years, civilizations rose and fell that most people have never even heard of. This is the story of how a continent became a country, and how that country became the most powerful nation on earth. Every victory, every betrayal, every moment that changed everything. This is the entire history of the United States. Imagine standing on the eastern coast of North America 500 years ago. What you would see is not an empty wilderness. It is a world teeming with life. Forests so thick that sunlight barely reaches the ground. Rivers wider than you can imagine, cutting through landscapes no European has ever mapped. And scattered across this enormous continent, millions of people, hundreds of nations, different languages, different beliefs, different systems of government. They had built cities. They had trade networks stretching thousands of miles. They had wars and alliances and stories passed down for generations. This was not a new world. It was an old one. And what happened next would be one of the most transformative and violent chapters in human history. From the first footprints on foreign soil to the moon landing and beyond, this is the story of America. Not the version you memorized in school, the real one. Long before any Europeans set sail, North America was home to one of the most complex and diverse collections of societies on the planet. In the Northeast, the Iroquois had built a sophisticated confederacy of 6 nations, with a system of representative government that would later, indirectly, inspire the Founding Fathers. In the Southeast, the Mississippian culture had constructed massive earthen mounds, some larger than the pyramids of Egypt at the time they were built, with cities like Cahokia housing tens of thousands of people. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans carved entire towns into the sides of cliffs, engineering irrigation systems that turned desert into farmland. On the Great Plains, the Lakota and the Comanche ruled landscapes that seemed to stretch into infinity, mastering the horse in ways that made them among the finest cavalry the world had ever seen. And on the West Coast, nations like the Chinook and the Chumash thrived along ocean shores so rich with life that they built permanent settlements and elaborate canoe-based trade routes. These were not primitive people stumbling through the wilderness. They were architects, farmers, diplomats, astronomers, and storytellers. They had shaped this continent for thousands of years, and they had no idea that across an ocean, ships were being built that would change everything, forever. In October of 1492, Christopher Columbus made landfall in the Bahamas. He never set foot on what is now the mainland United States, but his arrival cracked open a door that could never be closed. Within decades, Spanish explorers were pushing deep into the continent. Hernando de Soto marched an army through the American Southeast in 1540, encountering large towns and fertile fields. He also brought something far more devastating than any weapon: disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza swept through indigenous populations with apocalyptic fury. In some areas, 90% of the population died within a single generation. Entire civilizations collapsed, not because of military defeat, but because the very fabric of their societies was shredded by waves of invisible death. The social networks, the trade routes, the political structures that had held these nations together for centuries simply disintegrated. By the time English settlers arrived in North America a century later, they walked into a world that had already been catastrophically transformed. The fields were overgrown, the towns were empty, and to the new arrivals, it looked like virgin land. But it was not. It was a graveyard. The first permanent English settlement in North America was Jamestown, founded in 1607 in what is now Virginia. And from the very beginning, it was a nightmare. The colonists arrived with no farming skills, no understanding of the land, and an arrogant assumption that they could simply take what they needed. Within the first year, 80% of them were dead from starvation, disease, and conflict with the Powhatan people who had lived there for centuries. The colony survived only through a combination of forced labor, aggressive expansion, and the discovery that tobacco grew exceptionally well in the Virginia soil. Tobacco became the engine that drove the colonial economy, and it created an insatiable demand for labor. That demand would eventually be filled by the most brutal system of human exploitation the world had ever known. To the north, a different kind of colony took root. The Pilgrims arrived at Plymouth in 1620, and while the story of their peaceful first Thanksgiving has been romanticized beyond recognition, the early years in New England were defined by struggle, religious extremism, and a slow but relentless push into indigenous territory. Over the next century, 13 colonies would take shape along the eastern seaboard, each one different, each one growing, and each one increasingly resentful of the empire that controlled them from across the sea. By the 1760s, the American colonies were thriving. Philadelphia was the second largest city in the British Empire. Boston was a bustling port. The economy was booming. But the relationship with Britain was unraveling. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, had left Britain with enormous debt, and Parliament decided that the colonies should help pay it. A series of taxes followed: the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. Each one fueled anger. Each one deepened the divide. The colonists argued that they had no representation in Parliament and therefore no obligation to pay. The British argued that the colonies existed for the benefit of the Crown. It was a collision of ideas about power, rights, and identity that had been building for generations. On a cold night in December 1773, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor and threw 342 chests of tea into the water. The Boston Tea Party was not just a protest, it was a declaration. The following year, the First Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, and in April 1775, gunfire erupted at Lexington and Concord. The American Revolution had begun. What followed was a war that should have been unwinnable, a loose collection of farmers and merchants taking on the most powerful military on earth. But they had something the British did not: a cause, and a general named George Washington who refused to quit. The Revolutionary War was brutal, chaotic, and deeply divided. Not all Americans wanted independence. Loyalists fought alongside British regulars. Families were torn apart. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Washington lost more battles than he won. His armies starved at Valley Forge. Morale collapsed repeatedly. But a series of pivotal moments shifted the tide: the crossing of the Delaware, the victory at Saratoga, which convinced France to enter the war on the American side, and finally, in October 1781, the siege of Yorktown, where a combined American and French force trapped British General Cornwallis and forced his surrender. The war was over, and the world had changed forever. In 1787, delegates gathered in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. The debates were fierce: slavery, states' rights, the power of the presidency. The compromises they reached were extraordinary and deeply flawed at the same time. They created a system of government unlike anything that had ever existed, a republic built on checks and balances, with power derived not from a king but from the people, at least some of the people. The Constitution enshrined liberty while simultaneously protecting slavery. It proclaimed equality while denying it to millions. This contradiction was not a footnote in American history. It was the central tension that would define everything that followed. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory from France for roughly $15 million. In a single stroke, the United States more than doubled in size. The land stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains, from the Gulf of Mexico to the Canadian border. It was a deal so enormous and so improbable that it reshaped the trajectory of the nation. What followed was a relentless push westward. Explorers like Lewis and Clark mapped the new territories. Settlers poured across the Appalachians. New states entered the Union. But this expansion came with a terrible cost. Every acre of land that Americans claimed was land taken from someone else. The Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole peoples of the Southeast had built farms, schools, and governments. They had adopted many aspects of American culture, and none of it mattered. In 1830, President Andrew Jackson signed the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forced relocation of tens of thousands of Native Americans to territory west of the Mississippi. The Cherokee called it the Trail of Tears. Over 4,000 people died on that march, men, women, and children, buried in unmarked graves along roads that cut through forests they would never see again. Meanwhile, the ideology of manifest destiny took hold. The belief that Americans were divinely ordained to spread across the continent became a justification for conquest, for war, and for the near total destruction of the indigenous way of life. All the while, the question of slavery hung over the nation like a storm that would not break. The northern states had gradually abolished it. The southern states had expanded it. By 1850, there were nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States, and the economic system of the entire South was built on their forced labor. Cotton was king, and the invention of the cotton gin had made the institution more profitable and more entrenched than ever before. Every new territory that applied for statehood reignited the same agonizing debate. Would it be free or slave? Compromise after compromise attempted to hold the Union together, but each one only delayed the inevitable. The Missouri Compromise, the Compromise of 1850, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Each solution was temporary. Each one deepened the anger on both sides. Then, in 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, without carrying a single Southern state. Within weeks, South Carolina voted to secede. 6 more states followed. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. The American Civil War had begun. It would be the bloodiest conflict in the nation's history. Over 4 years, more than 600,000 Americans would die. Battlefields like Antietam, Gettysburg, and Shiloh became landscapes of unimaginable horror. Brothers fought brothers. Entire towns were wiped off the map. And at its core, the war was about one thing: whether a human being could be owned by another human being. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, the purpose of the war shifted. It was no longer just about preserving the Union. It was about ending slavery. And in April 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. The war was over. Slavery was dead. But the struggle for equality was just beginning. The period after the Civil War, known as Reconstruction, was a brief, extraordinary moment of possibility. For the first time, black men could vote. Black Americans were elected to local, state, and federal offices. Schools were built, churches were founded. A new society seemed to be taking shape in the South. But it did not last. White supremacist resistance was fierce and organized. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan used terror and violence to dismantle black political power. And by 1877, the federal government had withdrawn its troops from the South. Reconstruction was over. What replaced it was a system of racial segregation and oppression called Jim Crow that would last for nearly a century. Meanwhile, the rest of the country was undergoing a transformation so rapid that it felt like a different world. The Industrial Revolution had arrived in America with full force. Railroads stretched from coast to coast, factories multiplied, cities exploded in population. Immigrants poured in from Europe and Asia by the millions, drawn by the promise of work and freedom. Andrew Carnegie built an empire in steel. John D. Rockefeller dominated oil. J.P. Morgan controlled finance. A small group of men accumulated wealth on a scale the world had never seen. And at the bottom, millions of workers labored in dangerous conditions for wages that barely kept them alive. Child labor was common. Workdays could stretch to 12 or 14 hours. There were no safety regulations, no weekends, no protections. The Gilded Age, as Mark Twain called it, glittered on the surface and rotted underneath. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the United States began to look outward. The frontier was declared closed, the continent was settled, and a new generation of leaders believed that America's destiny lay beyond its borders. The Spanish-American War of 1898 announced the arrival of the United States as a global power. In a matter of months, America defeated Spain and acquired Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The era of American imperialism had begun. When the First World War erupted in Europe in 1914, the United States initially stayed out of it, but by 1917, President Woodrow Wilson had no choice. German submarine warfare had pushed America to the breaking point. More than 2 million American soldiers crossed the Atlantic. Their arrival helped tip the balance, and by November 1918, the war was over. America returned home to a decade of extraordinary energy. The 1920s roared. Jazz filled the airwaves. Flappers danced in speakeasies. Cars rolled off assembly lines in Detroit at a pace no one had thought possible. The stock market soared. It seemed like the good times would never end. But beneath the surface, the economy was built on borrowed money and speculation. And in October 1929, it all came crashing down. The Great Depression was the worst economic catastrophe in American history. Banks failed by the thousands. Factories shut their doors. Farms were foreclosed. Unemployment reached 25%. Millions of Americans lost everything. Bread lines stretched around city blocks. Families lived in shanty towns called Hoovervilles, named with bitter sarcasm after the president who seemed unable to stop the bleeding. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president, and he immediately launched the New Deal, a sweeping series of government programs designed to put people back to work, regulate the financial system, and provide a social safety net that had never existed before. It did not end the Depression, but it gave people hope. And then, on December 7, 1941, everything changed again. Japanese forces attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The United States was suddenly at war. And this time, it would not be a distant conflict. America mobilized with a speed and scale that stunned the world. Factories that had been silent a year earlier were now producing tanks, planes, and ammunition around the clock. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. More than 16 million Americans served in the military. The war took them to the beaches of Normandy, the jungles of the Pacific, the skies over Germany, and ultimately to a decision that would haunt humanity forever. In August 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Tens of thousands of civilians were vaporized in an instant. Japan surrendered, the war was over, and the world entered the nuclear age. After World War II, America stood at the peak of its power. Its economy was unmatched, its military was dominant, and a new rivalry was already forming with the Soviet Union that would define the next 4 decades. The Cold War was a conflict fought not on battlefields, but through proxies, paranoia, and a constant threat of annihilation. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine pledged to contain communism wherever it appeared. The Korean War followed, Then Vietnam, a conflict that would tear American society apart in ways not seen since the Civil War. Nightly television broadcasts brought the horrors of war into American living rooms for the first time. Protests erupted on college campuses across the country. Trust in government collapsed. But the Cold War era also produced extraordinary achievements. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education that racial segregation in public schools was unconstitutional. The civil rights movement erupted. Martin Luther King Jr. led marches, gave speeches that shook the conscience of a nation, and forced America to confront the original sin that had never been fully addressed. In 1964, the Civil Rights Act was signed into law. The Voting Rights Act followed in 1965. These were monumental victories, won at great cost. Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, Dr. King himself, assassinated in 1968 on a motel balcony in Memphis. The struggle for racial justice was far from over, but the legal framework of segregation had been dismantled. And in a different arena entirely, America was racing toward the stars. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy declared that the United States would put a man on the moon before the decade was out. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. It was a moment that transcended politics and ideology. For one brief, shining instant, the entire world watched in awe. The decades that followed were a roller coaster of triumph and turmoil. The 1970s brought Watergate, an energy crisis, and a deep loss of confidence in American institutions. The 1980s saw an economic resurgence under Ronald Reagan, but also a growing gap between rich and poor that would only widen in the years to come. The Cold War finally ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. America stood alone as the world's sole superpower. The 1990s were a period of remarkable economic growth, technological revolution, and a sense that history had somehow reached a stable endpoint. The Internet was born. The personal computer entered every home. And then came September 11th, 2001. 19 hijackers turned 4 commercial airplanes into weapons. The World Trade Center towers collapsed. The Pentagon was struck. Nearly 3,000 people died. It was the worst terrorist attack in American history, and it changed everything. The United States launched the War on Terror. Wars in Afghanistan and Iraq followed. Thousands more Americans died. Trillions of dollars were spent. And the consequences of those decisions are still unfolding today. In the years since, America has grappled with deepening political division, a financial crisis that nearly destroyed the global economy in 2008, the rise of social media and its destabilizing effects on democracy, and a growing awareness that the promises of equality and justice made centuries ago remain unfulfilled for millions. The election of Barack Obama in 2008, the first black president in American history, was a milestone that many thought they would never live to see. But it also revealed the depth of the racial and cultural fractures that run through the country. The events of recent years, from the COVID pandemic to the storming of the Capitol on January 6, 2021, have made it clear that the story of America is not a straight line of progress. It is a constant struggle, a nation forever wrestling with its own contradictions. And so, here we are. 500 years after the first Europeans arrived on shores that were never empty. Over 240 years since a group of revolutionaries declared that all men are created equal, even as they enslaved others. Through wars that nearly tore the country apart, through movements that forced it to live up to its own ideals, through economic revolutions, technological miracles, and moments of both extraordinary courage and devastating failure. The United States is not a finished project. It was never meant to be. It is an idea, constantly being tested, constantly being fought over, constantly being reinvented. The land itself endures. The mountains still stand. The rivers still run.
and the people who call this place home, all of them, from every corner of the globe, continue to write the next chapter of a story that is far from over. If you enjoyed this journey through time, consider subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments what country or civilization should we explore next.